Thanks very much, Oliver. So really, I suppose what I wanted to look at is kind of look through the prism of royal landscapes, the nature of kingship in early medieval Ireland. I don't really want to focus on a particular landscape, but try and take royal sites kind of broadly defined and the sort of nexus of different types and different orders of royal landscapes and how they worked together to create and maintain kingdoms. And really what I want to kind of emphasise is the necessity of looking at how these changed and their importance changed over time in Ireland, something which I think we've generally neglected. Kingship in Ireland is really famous for its sort of idiosyncrasies, really. It's famously sort of characterised as a sort of Celtic kingship, and priestly vegetables was a memorable term used by a historian to describe the characteristics of it. And really what that is that idea emphasises the idea that Irish kings really weren't kings, they were just priests, that they were sacral entities. Famously Irish kingship is kind of characterised as lacking the developed governmental apparatus of kind of Eastern, British and continental polities, sort of Germanic kingship for want of a better term, and that Irish kings didn't legislate, they didn't have a system of villa regalis or villa regia. They didn't really have any sort of governmental dimension, and this is something I think which is really problematic. Archaeologists have really tended to perpetuate that anachronistic view, really, by focusing correspondingly in studies of royal landscapes on things like ceremony and ideology, and applying sort of phenomenological analysis to royal sites as opposed to kind of thinking about other ways of looking at them. So famously, sort of studies of Irish kingship have kind of tried to reconstruct a sort of pristine Indo-European ideology of kingship, and highlighted very pertinent and very appropriate similarities between kingship rituals in Ireland and the kingship rituals associated with, for instance, Tara and places in Vedic India, and the sort of Ashmavedva ritual of paramount kingship. And while these are very appropriate analogies and well researched and everything, I would question the sort of appropriateness of that ideology to the experience and understanding of early medieval polities in Ireland. Did they really think this was a sort of archaic ritual? Did they see it in the sort of pristine manner in which it's often presented? And really, I suppose, I think the question that we've been failing to ask through analysis of royal landscapes is, what did polities actually do? And that's a very fundamental aspect of them. So that sort of insular, anachronistic and idiosyncratic view of Irish kingship contrasts really with the archaeology, where things like elite culture and the sort of quintessential characteristics of elite culture in Ireland and Western and Northern Britain are things like zoomorphic penannular brooches, which are really derived from a sort of Roman type of legitimate dress adornment, or late Roman type of adornment. Things like beadware, which, as Gordon showed earlier, comes from sort of the late antique world of the Mediterranean. And I suppose the other kind of quintessential characteristic is sort of fortified sites, and cashel is the example I have there on the top left, and the word cashel itself is a derivative of Latin castellum, and this really sort of highlights a sort of latent Latinity. So in the 5th and 6th century, the quintessential characteristics of elite culture in Ireland and indeed Western Britain are really sort of late antique as opposed to insular, and I think that's an important context that's not really often a wider context that's not really often brought to bear on the study of the subject. And so in terms of the nature and function of royal landscapes, we've generally tended to treat them in Ireland as kind of generic entities. So we've seen the functions of assembly and inauguration and a royal caput all rolled into one, invested in a single place, like for instance Tara. But it's actually it's incorrect to refer to somewhere like Tara as an assembly place. It was never an assembly place at any point in the early medieval period. Really, what we should be doing is looking for assembly places more generally, and trying to develop a sort of wider corpus of them. These are kind of distinctive sites, and Oliver's work in Scotland has really put Scotland on the map in that respect, but we've kind of lagged behind in Ireland to have a sort of critical understanding of what an assembly place is. Generally, what we find in Ireland is actually that we find these functions of assembly, inauguration and royal caput actually vested in distinct locales within particular landscapes. And within sort of an estate structure. So, for instance, the example I have on the bottom there is Dunseverick, the sort of royal capital of the kingdom of Dalriada in County Antrim. And just south of Dunseverick, Croagmore, there is the place of inauguration, whereas Knocksogie at the end of White Park Bay to the east is a place of assembly. So this is a royal landscape spread over about 5 or 6 kilometres, very extensive estate. Royal estate, and a sort of polyfocal one. And that's a sort of important context for these sites. But really, the miasma, really, as I see it, in terms of the study of kingship and the role of royal sites, is really the sort of perpetuation of this idea of a provincial structure of early medieval Ireland as a sort of an immutable and archaic structure. So the argument really goes that Ireland was divided into 5 provinces in later prehistory, which had sort of ceremonial capitals in the prehistoric period, and that these remained the basic structuring principle of early Irish territoriality throughout the early medieval period, even though we don't actually have any evidence that there was ever a provincial structure in Ireland between about the 5th century and the 8th century. The problem is that the fivefold provincial structure is seen to be a prehistoric entity because of the fact that these major provincial capitals are generally, in an archaeological sense, prehistoric ritual landscapes. But as we've tended to locate more recently the sort of medieval archaeology within these landscapes and see that they continue to be used during the medieval period, that structure has become increasingly untenable. Other major problems really pertain to the fact that while we have 5 provinces, we have 6 royal sites. So it doesn't really pan out when you try and map it out. And really Munster, which I've done a few studies of, is really the nail in the coffin for it, as it were, for the provincial structure. The early medieval texts tell us that these provincial centres were deserted in the 8th and 9th century, but in fact, as the archaeology shows, they were still centres of activity. Munster, there is absolutely no evidence that it was ever a unified single provincial entity much before the sort of 8th century. And Cashel, in that respect, as the sort of provincial capital of Munster, is really the problematic one in the bunch of 6 there. So the other major so-called provincial centres are united by a sort of monumental iconography that has its sort of origins or genesis in essentially the Iron Age, really. But Cashel is very different, and not just because there's a big 13th century cathedral stuck on the top of it. It's a very, very different landscape. So if Cashel isn't a prehistoric centre, what is it? So this is just some geophysics of Cashel, and I won't really go into this in any detail, but just suffice to say that after 11 kilometres squared of LiDAR analysis and 16 hectares of geophysical survey, which highlighted, very complex multi-period landscape, there's not a single bit of evidence for anything that looks like a prehistoric monument. So this is pretty definitive in a way. We simply don't have a prehistory at the Rock of Cashel in any great detail to speak of. And this is sort of borne out really when you look at evidence for in the start of the early medieval period. Cashel was sort of the centre of a regional polity, but not a sort of provincial polity in the sense of Munster, and it was actually preceded as the seat of that polity by a centre in East Limerick, Knockany. And this is just a LiDAR model of Knockany. I'll sort of skip through this because there's just 1 or 2 points that are really important. But this is a really complex multi-period landscape centering a ritual landscape centred on the hill of Knockany, and it stretches back in importance at least as far as the Neolithic. And this centre of Knockany in Limerick is much more comparable to somewhere like Tara in an archaeological sense. It has 2 Cursus monuments, a host of barrows, and a host of other things that really makes it a very complex multi-period prehistoric landscape. That's just zooming in on the eastern summit, which is a sort of ritual focus in later prehistory. There's a sort of string of barrows overlying a cursus on the top of the hill, and the centre, just after the top right, is a big cairn which is contained in a rectangular enclosure. But the importance of this really, the importance of Knockany is really borne out more so by some geophysical survey. And despite the fact that the geology kind of played havoc with the survey, and most of this isn't actually archaeology, it's just the geology. Some very interesting things that did show up is things like what seems to be a timber henge around the cairn on the top of the hill, and that's concentric with the sort of sub-rectangular enclosure around that cairn, but as well a figure of 8 structure, which is just this sort of green-looking thing there in the bottom corner. But this is really significant because this is a type of essentially temple architecture found at a very select group of sites in Ireland, like Dunalanya and Owenmacka, the major provincial centres. And this is seen to be the characteristic of a prehistoric royal landscape. So the fact that we can find one of these structures at a place which has never recorded provincial status really shows that provincial structure needs to go. We have to develop a new way of looking at these landscapes. So you can't just replace a Cashel with Knockany in Munster's sense as a prehistoric ritual landscape and say that the provincial structure is prehistoric in origins. I think we need to look to the early medieval period for how that structure developed in the medieval period. So sort of the key to doing that is looking at the dynasties of early medieval Ireland and what they actually, how they actually came about. So traditionally we would have thought that the major dynasties of early medieval Ireland, like the Nael and the Oganachta, that these were federations of biologically related dynasties who traced descent to an actual common ancestor in the 5th century, like Niall Noigallach or Conall Kirk in the Oganacht's case. But really, as recently historians have begun to question this, and actually what they tend to emphasise now is the fact that these dynastic federations are actually groups of disparate, unrelated peoples or regional polities which were joined together. So the language of consanguinity or the language of kinship expressed political alignment as opposed to an actual biological relationship. And I think that's something that you find elsewhere in sort of post-Roman Europe. But it's important in an Irish context because it resituates the development of these major dynastic federations from the 5th and 6th century into the 7th century in Ireland. And that's a very different archaeological landscape than the 5th and 6th century period. So, for instance, it resituates the genesis of these major dynastic federations into the same period in which the law tracts are being compiled in Ireland. So we have the largest corpus of vernacular law tracts anywhere in Europe in early medieval Ireland. They were all compiled more or less between 650 and 750 AD. And recently, legal historians have begun to emphasise that these aren't actually codifying an already existent hierarchy and structure, the sort of quintessential Celtic characteristic of Ireland. They're actually implicated in creating that hierarchy and curialising the practice of law. So bringing the practice of law into a defined judicial sphere controlled by the elite. And so it's no coincidence then that in the 8th century we see two legal traditions emerge in Ireland, the Brethyn Yevad tradition and the Seanchus Mór, which has a north and south focus, which reflects the major two spheres of political influence in Ireland, that of the Oganachta and the Nael. So I think we have here the sort of creation of hierarchies. And with all the excavations recently in Ireland as a part of the sort of Celtic Tiger boom years, we begin to see an actual settlement hierarchy emerging as well. But this again has a chronological distinction. In terms of the fact that we have 40,000 ring forts in Ireland, very important settlement archaeology, but it has a clear hierarchy in terms of the vallation or the amount of enclosures around these ring forts. So you have the univalate sites on the bottom, which are 7th century, multivalate ring forts, which are 6th to early 7th century in the middle, and then these very large multivalate ring forts, which are 5th to 6th century. But these ones on the top, the large multivalate sites, are actually concentrated at royal sites, and they've been argued to be sort of sacral in a way. So really what we have in the development of the settlement hierarchy that sort of characterises Ireland, its development and emergence in the 5th and 7th century, really is not just the codification of, again, an existing hierarchy, but the creation of a hierarchy associated, I would argue, with the genesis of these major dynastic federations which control Ireland. So that's a sort of wider important context to looking at the development of royal sites in this period. And just to take the issue of assembly particularly, the sort of equivalent of the moot or ting in Ireland is the Éanach. This was essentially the preeminent assembly of each kingdom or each level of polity in early medieval Ireland. And in common with other sorts of assemblies throughout northwestern Europe, it's a sort of a venue for rendering and redistributing tribute. It was a venue for law courts. It's associated with feasting and entertainment. But above all, it's actually associated with horse and chariot racing. And that's a sort of, taken to be sort of quintessentially Irish characteristic in a way, and sort of some people have connected it to this sort of Indo-European horse ideology of sort of sacred rulership. And, while that's all well and good, and we can debate it if we want, I think it's kind of hard to disassociate that association with horse and chariot racing with things like the Hippodrome in Constantinople and the rituals associated with the imperial circus in the late Roman and early Byzantine Empire. But this is sort of borne out in a way by the fact that the language of assembly in sort of 7th to 9th century texts in Ireland actually explicitly equates the Irish assembly practice with classical civic culture. So they use terms like circus, agon, theatrum and spectaculum in place of Éanach. from at least the 7th century. And it would be easy again to sort of argue that this is sort of later emulation of assembly practices which you see elsewhere in Europe, if it weren't for the fact that it's so early in an Irish context, and for the fact that some of the major assembly landscapes of early medieval Ireland have a large amount of Roman material from them. And this is the example of Éanna Clothair there, which is a sort of a LiDAR model of it. And just beside this, where this LiDAR is, there's one of the largest hoards of Roman material from Ireland. So this is really, you know, a sort of late antique context for sort of 5th to 7th century civic society in early medieval Ireland. But again, a sort of wider context of assembly landscapes in Ireland is an association with burial places. So it seems that actually burial places were used for assembly in early medieval Ireland. There's a specific association between sites that have been recently come to light in excavation, which are known as cemetery settlements or settlement cemeteries. And what these essentially were is locations of burial which are associated with large-scale evidence for feasting, craft and crop processing, craft and metalworking. And essentially what these are, they seem to be sort of local tuhar or sort of kin group places of assembly. And that's borne out by a sort of general correlation between these sites in Ireland and documented places of assembly. So just to give you one particular example, is the example of Enoch-Carman, which is sort of the major assembly of the province of Leinster. This has a number of these cemetery settlements or burial places associated with it, but they cluster around the boundaries of this landscape. So you've Corbally, which you've the plan of there on screen, Mullacash, Green Hills, and just at Coughlinstown there, there's a cemetery as well, which I haven't marked on the map. And these cemeteries are all 5th to 7th century and all within about 500 metres of the boundary of the royal estate associated with the assembly landscape of Enoch-Carman. So this is quite a striking correlation. But importantly, the burial in these complexes is 5th to 7th century, but activity at the sites continue into the 9th and 10th century, and in some cases slightly later. So this supports the identification of these as local assembly places, but also the fact that they cluster together within assembly landscapes suggests that they're also assembly places. And we can actually associate some of them with named kin groups. So for instance, Mullacash was the caput or assembly place of the Langany, a branch of the Bearca. And I'll come back to that point later. That's quite an important sort of issue with these landscapes. But more generally, aside from the correlation between major assembly landscapes and places of burial utilised for local assembly, is the fact that they're commonly associated with an early medieval church, and particularly conversion period churches. Of, we'll say, 115 assembly landscapes which I've documented in Ireland, 40 are associated with a Downach-type church. And this is particularly significant because Downach churches are the earliest form of church in early medieval Ireland. The word Downach comes from the Latin Dominicum, and it seems to have been a toponym that went out of use by the end of the 6th century, essentially. And the sort of formula of the names of these Downach churches associates them with particular kin groups and particular regional areas. So these have a sort of an administrative and pastoral function. But I think that the correlation of 5th to 7th century burial places, 5th to 6th century church sites, and documented royal assembly landscapes suggests that the assembly function of these landscapes is at least 5th to 6th century in origin in Ireland. And that's quite a significant fact. Or I suppose not so much a fact, but an argument really. But I think one of the sort of what this allows us to look at royal landscapes more generally is the fact that when you have these burial sites of the 5th, 6th and 7th century associated with conversion period churches, I think it's appropriate to see the advent of east-west extended burial in these landscapes as associated with the Christianisation or conversion of these landscapes and their associated polities. So this act of burial on the boundaries of these landscapes is emerging within a Christianising context. And that's important because in general, these burials in 5th, 6th and 7th century contexts have not been seen to be Christian in Ireland. It's been argued that these weren't Christian burials until the 8th century in Ireland, when the church legislated for proper Christian burial. So the argument goes that from the 8th century, these ancestral burial places and local assembly places were abandoned. in favour of churchyard burial, but this isn't actually the case. Many remained centres of burial in the 9th, 10th and 11th century. So what does that really say about royal landscapes and assembly structures more broadly? I think if we reframe the question, we get a slightly different perspective. If we ask when these sort of kin group burial and assembly places stopped being founded, virtually none are really founded in the 8th century or later. So really what that says is that kin groups were not manufacturing their sort of local kin-based identity through the act of burial in an assembly place. And that's a very important insight into the nature of these landscapes. And of course, that sort of drop-off in the foundation of these local assembly places is contemporary with the sort of genesis of these major dynastic federations and the first form of evidence we have for the existence of a sort of provincial consciousness or the creation of provinces in Ireland. So I think, I don't know why that picture is there in the bottom right. I haven't seen that before, ever. But I think when we look at these major provincial landscapes or the provincial capitals like Owenmacka, Rathcroghan or Dunallia, the fact that recently we've recognised early medieval archaeological evidence from these landscapes and the fact that those particular 3 examples are documented as places of Éannig, I think we've really misunderstood them. They're not centres of ceremony and inauguration necessarily in the early medieval period, but centres of assembly. And we need to assign their role as provincial sites to the early medieval period. So that is, they're becoming provincial centres because of the role they played within polities in the early medieval period. So they're sort of emerging as provincial capitals in the 8th century, I would suggest. And if we look at the example of Leinster, it's important to note that Enoch-Carman, which I had an example of there a few minutes ago, is actually only a couple of kilometres northeast of Dunallia, the supposed prehistoric capital of Leinster. And while this is seen to be a sort of prehistoric site, it's actually one which stretched into the 7th and 8th centuries. And the first reference to Carman in the Annals is actually contemporary with the last reference to Dunallia in the Annals as well. So it seems that there's a sort of shift from these 2 sites, but they're part of a single landscape, a sort of broad central place associated with the creation of a sort of province of Leinster. And that's important because the fall-off in burial in Enoch-Carman in the 7th century is contemporary with the emergence and ascendance of the group who were associated with the development of an idea of a province of Leinster. And we see a similar sort of example in the case of Nenagh. This was the assembly place of East Munster, so a district within the province of Munster. And really what we have in Munster is the creation of a sort of hierarchical structure of administrative jurisdictions, sort of East Munster, West Munster, North Munster and South Munster. And Nenagh was the assembly place for the district of East Munster. But again, we have the same sort of archaeology, 5th to 8th century burial place associated with sort of feasting evidence, crop processing, craft working. But that burial site of Carrigator Harding there in the bottom left falls out of use in the 8th century, and activity shifts to the sort of mound there in the top right, which is Tullaheedy. The important point is that this is actually a natural knoll, but in the 8th century this was converted into a mound by the digging of a ditch around the knoll. And what this actually seems to have been was the creation of an assembly mound. The townland Tullaheedy, I would suggest, probably derives from Tullach Teda, and Teda was the sort of mythical ancestress associated with the Assembly of East Munster. The original name of Éanach O'Ruven, or the Assembly of East Munster, was Éanach Teda. So this is a sort of the mythologization of assembly landscapes associated with the sort of creation of origin myths which unified different peoples. And we see this expressed in assembly landscapes through the cessation of burial in ancestral burial places, even though they continued to be local assembly places. They just stopped having a burial function. And I think what we're seeing here is a sort of the formation of law provinces in a way, where we have contemporary with all these developments, the promulgation of laws over these sort of nascent provincial kingdoms of Munster, Leinster and so on. And it's appropriate that the earliest actual example of a coin or a law promulgated by a king in Ireland is actually associated with the creation of the Oganacht Federation and the sort of genesis of a provincial kingship for the kingship of Cashel. And associated with these sort of developments, we also have the use of these promulgation of these laws as sort of inauguration venues. So in the case of Rathcroghan and in Munster, we have evidence for the actual promulgation of laws over certain nascent provinces at the same time as kings are elevated or inaugurated through the act of acclamation in an assembly. So this isn't exactly a sort of complex ceremony and procession of inauguration as we'd be used to thinking of these landscapes, but the sort of use of inauguration through assembly. And Rathcroghan is a really, really good example of that. And so sort of finally, just to sum up, I think what we see in these landscapes is a sort of territorialisation of kingship and the scales of identity that assembly landscapes were constructing. So far from constructing a sort of localised sort of identity of a king group, these were constructing sort of almost generic sort of territorial identities, the sort of provincial identities. And we see this in the actual transformation of these places of local assembly into centres of kingship and tribute for regional kingdoms. So local assembly places from the 8th and 9th century started to become centres of a sort of villa regalis system, or a structure of royal centres to which tribute was paid. And we see this manifest in the archaeology of these landscapes through concentrations of things like souterrains, which were used for storing food. So these are sort of centres of redistributive systems of tribute and render from the 8th to 9th century onwards. And also in the ceremony of inauguration of the major kingships of Tara and Cashel. So in the case of Tara and Cashel, we can actually trace the ceremony of inauguration for these landscapes over the course of maybe 6-7 kilometres, so very protracted, large-scale ceremonies. But when you contrast this with the fact that there's only really evidence for explicit protracted inauguration ceremonies for Tara and Cashel, there's not really for any other kingship of early medieval Ireland. I think these are very significant differences between the sort of provincial and large-scale kingships in Ireland. But what we actually have in these sort of large-scale protracted ceremonies is a sort of polysemic ceremony. So they can be used, if you want, in the sort of traditional understanding of Irish kingship to look for a sort of union of a king and a goddess. But they also seem to emphasise telach, which was a legal ritual for taking possession of land. And in Cashel's case, this is performed on a monumental scale through the actual procession through the landscape. There's 3 stages of the telach ritual, and those 3 stages are alluded to and mimicked in the actual inauguration procession. So I think what this is the transformation of these kingships and the territories for which they're controlling into territorial entities as opposed to amalgamations of people and dynasties. So it's a sort of territorial authority based more on sovereignty than suzerainty. So really, I suppose it brings Irish kingship in a way into the sort of general narrative of European kingship. There's actually many similarities between the development of kingship in Ireland and the role of royal landscapes with other areas of sort of northwestern Europe that haven't really been appreciated, because we've seen these landscapes as sort of archaic and sort of Celtic, and look to the ceremonial element at the expense of their sort of role in the practice of these kingdoms. So I'll leave it at that, and that's just a list of some people that have helped along the way. So thanks.